Hi, and welcome to the Urban Tech VC, a podcast for urban leaders shaping the cities of tomorrow. If you love our show, do drop us a review, share it with your friends, and follow 2BX on LinkedIn or Instagram. Today, we're happy to welcome Thibault, Senior Project Manager at the SIGNA Group. He is in charge of the development of Project Karstadt am Hermannplatz in Berlin, and has some super interesting insights about not only the project, but circular construction and sustainable buildings. If you're an urban tech founder about to raise a round, do reach out to us. We'd love to connect and see if we should play together.
Thibault, happy to have you with us, as we know each other for quite a while now, but many of our audience probably don't. It would be great if you could give us a brief introduction to yourself. So who are you? What do you do? What was your journey so far?
Okay, great. Hi, Katharina. Hi, Mark. I'm super happy to be with you today. So my name is Thibault Chavanat. I'm an engineer. I am French. I studied in France and in Israel, a bit in India as well. I'm working for 10 years now, and I have always worked more or less in the real estate industry. And I'm with SIGNA, so my actual company, since 2019, where I lead a big project in Berlin called Karstadt at Hermannplatz, which is a big development project.
Nice.
And what have you done before you joined SIGNA? So have you always been in development, or how did you end up leading such a huge project?
Yeah, it's a long journey. I started just after the studies working for a big real estate development company in Paris. A few months after I joined, the company bought a German subsidiary. So because I spoke a bit of German, I moved there to help. And that's how it started. But before that, if I understand your question correctly, why did I choose the real estate industry more than architecture or other things? I have always wanted to work in cities, in the urban environment and context, and to bring some solutions to understand a bit what's going on in the streets around me. And I did my final internship during my studies in a municipality in the north of France called Dunkirk, which is well known through the battle in the Second World War. And in Dunkirk, it's the first time where I really realized who has which influence in the urban development among the public actors, the private actors, the architects, the designers, and so on and so on. And it was for me very clear that the private landlord side is really the side where you can quickly learn and quickly make a difference because you're super agile in the concept you can develop and so on. And that's why I started in the private real estate industry. Super interesting experience, yeah.
So you really want to have an impact there. And what we definitely have in common, I would say, Thibault, is that all of us love to work in cities and to really find solutions in urban areas.
Yeah. My father is in the military. Since I was born, we moved every 2 years. And we moved always from the Parisian region to the south of France, and then back and in different cities. And that's why very early I became aware that there are different atmosphere in cities, different qualities, different spaces. And I don't know, maybe it started like that. Like I always compared the place where I lived and I had preferences and so on. And so that's why sensibility to the urban environment where we live is important to do what we do.
When you say you moved a lot, what was the most, let's say, memorable experience that you had in what city and why?
It's a good question. Actually, it's funny because I didn't at all plan to speak about this with you this morning. It just came like that. The most crazy move I made is we were living in the south of France near Avignon in a small city where, we had a super, not countryside life, but a small city life. So, I went to school with my bike. I played tennis. Everything was super easy. And then I joined for a gymnasium, so for a high school in Paris, and we lived in the middle of Paris, and we moved, the first day of school was, I think, the 1st of September, and we moved on the 29th of August, so really last minute move. And I remember my first journey from home to gymnasium and coming in this huge Parisian high school building where everything was different, the traffic, the noise, the people, how you dress, how the buildings are together and so on. And it was a real shock. I was really not prepared at all to this metropolitan life, and it was a real shock.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that, actually.
Yeah, I think many of us experience that. Maybe a bit later, not necessarily by gymnasium, but when you study somewhere, you always have this shock where you come in a city that you don't know, and wow, you're blasted by the size and the liveliness of the big city. It's always a crazy experience, I think.
And now we're all in love with cities somehow. This is Nice. I would really love to jump into the first topic today. We would love to talk about the big project. So you were very active in a pretty unique project, we would say, at Hermannplatz here in Berlin. It was called Reparked. And you presented it back then to the 2BX team. And we were really very impressed. I told you that before, like really inspired by you and your passion for this project. So could you please just like briefly describe what is the project about, what makes it that special?
First, before we talk about Reparked, which is a part of this project, it's important to give you a bit of context. So Karstadt at Hermannplatz is a place in Berlin at the border between Kreuzberg and Neukölln, who are two of the most lively neighborhoods in the city. We, SIGNA, so the company I work for, bought the building in 2016, I think, with a very clear idea about what we want to do with it, but very clear architectural idea. Like their building has been developed in the 50s, 70s, 90s with different remodeling steps. The place is very well known for a historical building that was built in the 1920s. It was an iconic architecture with two very high towers up to 70 meters. It was the biggest department store in Europe at that time and so on. And we bought this building because of this historical example that once stands there. So now it's not visible anymore. You have some signs and some small parts of the building that indicates that it has a glorious past, but you don't really recognize, and it's a pretty normal building. So, and we bought with the vision to rebuild it. And this was a very strong vision because it's very rare in such a project that you start the project with a very clear architectural vision for what you want to build. So this helped a bit because it clarifies the ambition. It was also a big challenge to try to be creative and innovative with this given architecture, right? And we very quickly felt that this vision was not enough to create a story that convinces the municipality and the inhabitants that this project is good for them. And that's why we worked on the other aspects of the project. So how do we want to build it? What is the ecological and the social contribution of this project, and so on and so on. And we digged in these topics for years, so starting 2019, to try to make a better project out of this vision. That's how it started.
You mentioned that it's unusual to have like a clear vision of the project at the beginning, right?
So in our business, for what we do at SIGNA, so we only concentrate on 1A locations, so core city center, very iconic places. We usually have an idea about the volume and the size of things we want to build, but the architecture itself, the facades, the colors, the materials, it's something that is developed throughout time, often with the competition, and it is something often you don't know when you buy the place. Here, for us, it was on the other way around. We bought the place because of this vision. What you have to know is that this building was really super famous. So we have a lot of historical plans, of pictures. So we know exactly how the facade was, how deep it was, how the stone were prepared to be assembled, how the glass were. We know everything because we have this model, right? And this is something which is really unique and which is, on the one hand, a chance, on the other hand, a constraint because you're a bit blocked in your creativity because it's all there, right?
Thibault, you mentioned that you acquired this building 2016, right?
Yeah.
With a clear vision. Now we're 6 years later, more or less. Is it still the same vision? Is it still the same project? Or how often and how fundamentally did it change? And if so, what and why?
Yeah. The surface of the project, so the appearance of it, hasn't changed much. So the vision, the architecture is still very clear because we think it's a key driver for attractivity, right? If we want to create an attractive places, the link with the history and to relive this past and to update it for our days is something which we still believe is super attractive and super relevant for this project. But in the background, the project changed completely. So after having developed this vision and after having a bit heard what inhabitants and the politics has to say, we tried to focus on the topics that at that time in 2019 really became more important, and it's a topic of carbon footprint, right? So we analyzed a bit our carbon footprint, and we very quickly realized that like demolishing a building that is not nice and not super efficient, but still a good working building is a nonsense, right? It's something you can't really do anymore without having checked all possibilities to avoid a demolition, right? We checked that, and the first phase of this development was really to come to the big result that we can build this historical building and this huge volume without demolishing the actual building. So we just dismount the facade and all the interior fit out. We clean and we prepare the steel and the concrete steel structure to be elevated with wooden floors. And therefore, we create a building that has the same volume, and at the end, the same facade probably, but a very different carbon footprint because we don't demolish and we add wood, which stores carbon. The carbon footprint of this major part of the project has been completely optimized in this first phase.
That is a pretty massive change, right, in terms of like how you plan and how you look at the whole project. But let's now jump into, let's say, a part of the Hermannplatz project where you have particularly achieved already something awesome when it comes to the planning phase, and that's the Repark project.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So could you give us a little bit of an overview? What is the Repark project? What did you do there? And what makes it so unique and special, I think, in Europe, right?
Yeah. So the Repark project is a step that followed this decision to not demolish the actual building. We took this decision. We realized two things. The first thing is that even if we don't demolish the concrete structure, we still have a lot of waste coming from the demolition of the facade and of the interior fit out, and waste which is, in this particular case, of high value. Like on the actual facade, we have a lot of aluminium, which is carbon intensive. We have a lot of glass, which is also very intensive in carbon footprint. We have a lot of natural stone coming from quarries in Germany, which are now empty. So, things that have material value, but that also have cultural value, right? So people on site, they know this building, they know these materials, and, just to take them out and to trash them away is a low intelligence solution, if I may say. And the question we had was, what do we do with this tons of materials that we gain from the part demolition of the front building? And the second aspect is that today at Hermannplatz, behind this department store building, we have a strange space, like an old car park with 7 stories, which is 2/3 empty. We have this huge delivery zone, which is not really used. And there we developed with David Chipperfield, who is the lead architect for the project, a vision to densify the space and to give it back to the city, like to create an urban space that is attractive, where things happen. And our model was a bit Hackische Höfe in Berlin, which are not far from where you stay, I think. And this was really the vision of a passage where we create different scales of buildings. We create courtyards with a succession of volumes and of spaces that became attractive. So these were the two pillars for the Repark project. On the one hand, we had a master plan with an architectural vision, what we want to do behind, so create some new buildings to create courtyards. And on the other side, we had this tons of material that we didn't know what to do with them. And we started a competition, an international competition, which was called the reuse competition. The goal was for the architects that we called to try to reuse all the materials from our building in the master plan vision we developed for the back of the building. So this is something that has been done in the past already under the motto form follows availability. So meaning your design follows the availability of the materials you have. What was really new in our project is that we don't use materials from somewhere. We use the material from the project, right? So it's super circular because form follows availability inside the project itself, right? And this is something that brings, as I told you before, cultural value, because we use materials that people know and that are on site, and you close the loop somehow. And also ecological value, because you reuse, so you avoid trash, but you reuse on site. So you avoid a lot of transport, you avoid a lot of many things that come with the transport and preparation of materials for a building site like that. So this was the competition, this was the idea. We tried to find architects that were keen on working on that in Europe and that have already some experience because it's super complex. And we found, I think, 12 architects who were willing to take part of the competition. And this all started in December 21.
That to me sounds, this is very interesting, but it also sounds like a huge amount of limitations, right, for the architects that were participating in this project, right, and delivering their suggestions.
Yeah.
How did they deal with these many restrictions, or did they see it as restrictions or constraints or as a chance?
That's exactly the point, right? Our job in the preparation of this competition was really to find architects who have enthusiasm for this kind of thing and that see more opportunity for creativity and limitations in the constraint we defined, in the frame we defined for this competition. And this was a super good filter. We felt after 2-3 phone calls, if they see it as a dumb limitation or as a, wow, how exciting is this? And of course, and this is why we came to the 12 architects. We found 12 architects that were super happy to take part and that really, out of ethical reasons were super happy, proud, and it was for them super important to take part and to show that with this limitation, you can create a new aesthetic, and a new architecture that is desired and that really makes sense for the city. The result of this competition is the Repark project. So we had 12 concepts in 2 phases. In the second phase, we had 2 shortlisted architects, and Reparkt was one of the 2 from SIGNA Group, who is an architectural practice based in Copenhagen. And they presented this project that really convinced us for 2 reasons. On the design perspective, they really created a timeless architecture out of reused materials. So we didn't want the result, to be like a stylish reuse plaidoyer that is super, obvious, because we want it to be timeless. If we create something that is sexy for the 10 coming years, but then is too obviously reuse ideology, it doesn't bring much, because in 10 years, the next generation will still want to change and to create new things and so on. So that's why it was super important to create a timeless aesthetic and to have someone who is really capable of tackling the huge technical challenges that are coming. And this is something where SIGNA in Copenhagen really convinced us, because they build already like that in there. We will be there next week to visit their sites and to really check their technical competence. But we really had the feeling super quickly in the different workshops we had with them that they know what they do. They're completely convinced. And these are partners in the design team that we really need, because we need them to fight for their ideas, because a design process is super complex. And if you have someone who is a bit neutral, the ideas get lost, and at the end they are weak and you don't recognize them anymore. So we need a fighter, and we found a fighter. So
this is cool to hear. Like, you really seem to be very convinced that you found the perfect match there. You could only choose out of 12, right?
Yeah.
So it was good that you found that match, because that could have been a challenge.
Let's jump a little bit to our next topic here. I mean, we will obviously get back to the Reparkt project at any given point in time. Our second topic circles a lot around circular construction, right? And general challenges that we face here. And what we figured is, I mean, this project is very unique, but I think when it comes to zeitgeist, right, it should be very common to think more often in circular value chains and circular construction cycles. But what we also heard is, 12 architects doesn't sound much. You were telling us that a lot of architects had constraints and were not thinking the way that you like them to think with regards to this very circular approach. So would you say that circular construction in general will become more common, or is already common, or is it still kind of like lighthouse projects that are affected by circular construction approaches?
Yeah, Mark, I think it's really both. Like, on the one hand, it's really something that every architect is keen on trying and doing. Also because they're, architects for future and so on. These are massive movements in the youth and so on. And they know they will find their new talents only if they work on projects like these. So I think it's clear for every architect that this is the direction where we have to go, to build less carbon intensive. But on the other hand, it's something which is still not there yet, right? So what we do is still extremely new. Like in Berlin, there have been few experiments on smaller projects, how you can reuse stuff and make it still in an economical and ecological way, but it's still very new. And what I tell you with a lot of enthusiasm is still to be realized, right? We don't know how exactly we'll do that. So with Rainer, who is the head of development for our project here in northern Germany, we took this decision knowing that we don't know yet how to do it. It's something new. We have to learn from it. We have to experiment. And we know that the partners we need around SIGNA in Berlin to do that, so the entire value chain of demolishing companies, construction management, also the producer of materials, right? So the cement and concrete companies, the one doing windows and so on. We need all these people to work with us in a good process to deliver what we promised, right? And this is something where SIGNA at the very beginning told us, parallel to our design, so the standard design an architect does for such a project, we need a material innovation process. So we need from the very beginning to check how we will reuse. And we need to create around this project an ecosystem of people who will be our partners to deliver what we promised. So to reuse these material parts and these building parts and materials in a good way. And this is something which is not there yet. So we need to build this ecosystem still.
You were talking about the people that are needed and hard to find because most of them don't have any traction or experience in that field. Let's have a look at the tech side. Like, was there any tech that was useful during the process of circular construction, or any tech solution where you thought like, oh, I would definitely need that kind of solution now?
Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, it's something you know better than me, but there are many startups trying to solve problems at this level. Madaster, for example, is a company which is focusing on making sure that the buildings of today are somehow digitalized and recorded to make sure we can do what we try to do at Hermannplatz in the coming years very easily, because we immediately have in one click the entire list of materials, their entire characteristics and so on. But this is something which is like they prepare now the possibility to do it in the future, which is not at all our topic at Hermannplatz. At Hermannplatz, we have a building which is for some parts 100 years old with like 7 or maybe 8 or 10 like different remodeling steps where we don't have any plans, we don't know what is there, and the way to digitalize that and to make this information available for the designers is still something that it's work on site where you have to go with a meter and try to analyze what you have on site. And this is something it's super difficult to digitalize. We tried and we did it in some way, but it's not easy.
So no existing solutions you could work with at least, but for sure something where founders out there could take an eye on. Super important to help there, because we are convinced as 2BX that it's more about modernization and work with existing buildings and how to use those.
Yeah, but Thibault, if you could name one thing, right? One thing, only one thing, that would have helped you the most in the process of looking at this project with a circular view, right? What would it be? If you say that this was the biggest pain point and if someone could solve me this pain point, I would pay for it.
I think I would definitely pay for a solution that helps us understand the building, right? So understand means what do we have there? How many materials? And this is a combination of many different expertise. Today you have I don't know the word in English anymore, an camesa, someone who comes and measures things, right?
Yeah.
This is one expertise we need. Then you have some guys testing materials, so telling you exactly what is your concrete, how is it made, from when is it, what are the characteristics, and so on. Then you have people who are experts by it to look at, so not the walls and the concrete structure, but the building parts, right? So the door, the window, to analyze it and so on, and to gather this all together on a platform where you can easily share information. This is something I would definitely pay for. This is something we found partly. We work with Concula. They have such a platform, but they're still only integrators of different things that we as a landlord have to very carefully mission, measurements and so on. This is something we still have to coordinate, and they have a platform which makes information sharing a bit easier. But a one-stop shop where you get a clear analysis of what is my building and so on is super important. This is something which in the processes in our actual project takes a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of coordination. And I think it's possible to gain efficiency by having players who are specialized on this. I will tell you what you have in your portfolio. What is your building? Right? This is something I think is really missing. For example, this also means you have to go in the archives of Karstadt in Essen or here in the Amt and look for plans that have been there for 50 years, And this is something that I have done for this project, because if I don't do it, nobody does it. But you have no player really expert in doing that. And it's a lot of paperwork. It's also a lot of experience. How do you have 2 hours in the basement of the municipality and you have like hundreds of boxes and you need to quickly check what is the plans and how do you digitalize it. And I think this is something which can become much more efficient.
You mentioned that what was special about this project was also that you not only having a circular construction, but reusing the material in the same project, that this was pretty special.
Yeah.
In your opinion, what is the most critical part in circular construction, especially when it comes to urban areas and reuse it in the same project? Does it make a difference there?
I think one of the main risks we're taking right now as a developer is the timing and the cost. On the Repark project, for example, we intend to reuse almost 4,000 square meters of glass that are today built in windows on the actual department store, and we dismount it, we separate the glass from the structure around it, we recut the glass in the right size, and we reframe it with wooden frames for the new building, right? One example. And this is something where, on theory, it's pretty easy to draw a flowchart and to explain you how it works, right? The real life is that you will probably, by dismounting, break 20% of it. And then you will realize by measuring that the exact characteristic of the glass is not exactly what you need, and it's slightly not enough to match the existing regulation. So you can't do anything. So you have to double the glass, and then you don't have enough. And then, so all these are processes that are much more complex and risky for us than just ordering 100 new windows from the next manufacturer, right? So it takes more time, more money. And at the end, what is the economical result of this entire process is something which is still a big question mark for us. So our job right now with Rainer is to really gather the right partners to make sure we make the most out of it. But it's a risk we take in terms of time and money are huge.
You're mentioning the risks, right? But with risks, there always goes an opportunity alongside. And as we understood, and I mean, you showed us some numbers, right? So compared to a new structure, you're reducing the embodied CO2 or carbon by 64%, right? With this Repark project, which is like very impressive in my opinion. So there lies an opportunity. I think at the moment we have the problem that this opportunity that goes along with sustainable or reducing the carbon footprint is something that is used more or less with marketing, but does not really have a price tag yet when it comes to the P&L or the business case for the construction site or the building itself, right?
This is true today, but we do it because we believe it won't be true in a few years. You know, we believe, for example, that in a few years you will get a building permit only if you can demonstrate that your carbon footprint for your development is low enough, right? And gaining today experience in these fields, today we will be, with this project, we will be learning a lot, you know, and we will know much better what it means to reuse materials, what it brings in terms of carbon footprint optimization, what it costs in terms of time and money. And this is something which is a treasure for us when the regulation will evolve. And I'm convinced, and we are convinced, that in a few years, you have to show your carbon footprint, otherwise you can't build, right? So this is true. But another very contextual reason is, for example, if you do that, if you reuse a lot of your materials, you are much more independent of crises in the world, like the crisis in Ukraine, right? The increase in construction costs doesn't hit you the same way because over 50% of the material you need are already there and you already own them. It's maybe a bit simplified, but it's also something that counts.
Okay, but at the moment, I mean, we agree that at the moment the price tag still is a little bit higher when it comes to like simply money spent per square meter.
We don't know. Our assumption is it costs as much. This is our assumption in our developer calculation. This is something we don't know. This is something we will learn.
Okay.
We'll see.
But maybe one last question to this topic. You mentioned something very interesting, right? The regulatory body and how governments will interfere with building permits and stuff like that. I read an article about France pushing in that direction. And as we're looking at from a European perspective, are you familiar with the regulation in France? Would be my first question. They're pushing now into giving permits and renting out buildings, right, only if you reduce carbon footprint and stuff like that. So would you say that that is a role model for Europe and that this regulation will be copied by other legislations as well?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm not an expert. I don't know. I just read a bit But yes, of course. So it's funny you ask this because this afternoon I have a 3-hour workshop with French colleagues that are part of an association called the Low Carbon Building Association, which has a gathering of architects and developers that in the last years in France developed a carbon footprint methodology that has been adopted more or less like that by the French state for the new regulation in place. And the new regulation is that starting already January 22, so a few months ago, you have to submit a carbon footprint analysis with your building permit. And the threshold, so the max amount you're allowed to get for your project is still very high, so everybody achieves it, but every year it will be lower. So the French industry is already forced to think in terms of carbon footprint, get used to it, and in a few years, it will be a constraint that would count in the design. The same thing is happening in Denmark, starting next year, so a year later than in France. And in every European country is in preparation. In the Koalitionsvertrag in Germany, in the government agreement, there's also 1 or 2 sentences that could mean such a regulation. And as you said, the European level is probably the right one. And I think many things are in preparation and it's a good thing.
We would like to focus now on the sustainability of buildings. And one thing you mentioned when you presented the project to us at 2BX was that creating beautiful buildings is the most sustainable way of building because no one wants to demolish it, right? So even after decades, people want to stay how it is. So important question here is, what is a beautiful building in your opinion? And what is your view on how to reach that there are urban areas with much more sustainable buildings?
It's a good question. Actually, this sentence or this idea is not from me. It's something I read from Dietmar Eberle, who is a very famous architect, and he very often explains this idea, and I think it's super true. And then the question, what is a beautiful building, is an impossible question. I think it's a question more for architects than for me, but a beautiful building is a building people love, right? And how you do that, there are very different ways to do it. So extremely difficult to answer. But just maybe to focus on the last part of your question, what is a sustainable building and why is a beautiful building important, is that the carbon footprint analysis is always in two parts. You have the construction phase and you have the operation. And right now we always have you have your first step. So you invest X thousand tons of CO2 of carbon for the construction. And then every year, because you consume oil and gas and so on to heat and to cool and so on, after the start, the curve of your consumption of your carbon emissions continue to grow, right? And this is something which will be less and less true because we are electrifying our buildings. The entire energy things are getting electrified. And we all work under the assumption that the electricity production mix in Germany, but also in Europe, will become carbon neutral by 2035 or a bit later. And this is why the operation phase of the building will become less and less relevant in the carbon footprint, right? Because if you assume that your electricity is carbon free or carbon neutral, and you have only heat pumps and so on working for your buildings, the operation phase is super low in terms of carbon. So the construction phase becomes the key factor to diminish your carbon footprint. And this is why beauty is important, because the carbon footprint of the construction is necessary only when you demolish or when you remodel in a large way. This is the only phase in the building's life where you really emit carbon. And this is why the idea of Dietmar Eberle to say we have to create beautiful buildings that people love and that people use and that people like to use is super relevant, because you want to have this block of carbon emissions during construction as rarely as possible in the building's life.
I really like the picture of something beautiful is when people love a building, and loving a building is pretty abstract, I'd say. And yet I know that people can love buildings. And it's connected to what you said when it comes to the Hermannplatz project, where you mentioned that you want to give something back to the district, to the area, to the people. And this is a good step, right? To let people fall in love with buildings, to interact with buildings, to feel comfortable there.
Yeah, and I think this is something we all have been surprised by the proposition of Lendager. In the Repark project, they use the beams of the actual parking house to create a new facade. So it creates a very strange facade that nobody would have designed like that without this reuse constraint, right? So it's a clear result of this huge constraint, but it still creates somehow, it's like exactly where the magic happened, from the architecture, where somehow everybody in the room, as we had this jury discussion, said, wow, it's a beautiful facade. Mm-hmm. And it's beautiful because reuse is visible. You somehow understand that these parts come from another building, but it's still a timeless, nice facade, which has a structure, which is super luminous, which is super clear. So this is exactly where we as developers need architects to develop this kind of nice things that are a bit magical. It's difficult to define.
What you mentioned, that magic happened because of collaboration there. It is because you as developers said, we want to do this that way. You look for architects who were focused on that. It wouldn't have happened without collaboration of different stakeholders here, I'd guess.
Yeah, but I mean, we have to acknowledge, right? This approach that you just mentioned still is not common yet, right? And I mean, construction phase and sustainability and reuse and circularity in the construction phase is one thing. When we look at the life cycle of a building, it's a totally different thing. What is your take on that, especially on the second part when it comes to, let's say, life cycle and what you always say as a neutral use concept, so the ability to reuse buildings and repurpose buildings?
Our job is really to create buildings that will be as intact as possible for 100 years, And this is exactly in Berlin, for example, the entire Gewerbehöfe, so this building and courtyards that have been produced for manufacturing industries in the 1900s, for example, these buildings are still there, right? And they have been a bit remodeled, a bit redesigned. You can add different light, different materials for the interior design, but they are still there, and they didn't cost 1 gram of carbon in their structure since 100 years, and this is for me, it's the only success factors that defines a good and sustainable building, and of course they emit carbon during the operation phases because they had at the beginning very old, oil heating systems and so on. But this is something that we anyway optimize year after year. And now we are, going to have a very efficient electricity production mix with less carbon. So this is something that will solve itself almost alone, independently from us as a developer, right? So our job is really to focus on the life cycle. So when do we build? When do we have to demolish? And when we demolish, how do we do it in a clean way, right? The concept of Ländager, for example, is also interesting in the Repark project because we create new spaces out of the existing building structure that are extremely flexible because they have a huge height. We have above 5 meter height. So these are spaces where we already now can say they will survive a few generations, right? Because they are so flexible and the volume you have at your disposition when you, as a user, is so huge and flexible that, if you want to live in it, if you want to work in it, if you want to party in it, if you want to make theater or movies in it, you can do everything in these spaces. So there will be no reason to demolish them. And this is the opposite from the buildings here at the end of Kudamm. There are some office spaces from the 70s that were still working well that are being demolished because the expectations of office users have changed a bit. And these spaces were so specialized that you have no other choice than to demolish them to accommodate the wishes from the users today, right? So this is the opposite example. If you optimize too much, you create spaces that are not flexible at all.
Maybe Thibault, last very short question, and hopefully with a very brief yes or no answer, a little bit provocative. Would you say if we want to get control over carbon and carbon emissions for real estate, we should focus more on circular construction than on actually running the buildings energy efficient? Yes or no? Because one leads to the other.
No, I think it's both. It's really both. But what I say is that the efficiency of the operation phase is not something which is in our hands, right? So not only we create carbon neutral buildings in operations only because the electricity mix is getting better. And this is something we don't influence. A very complex question. I don't want to be.
Okay, then, Thibault, we love to end the episodes with a quick fire round. Now it's all about speed and gut feeling here. There's no right or wrong.
Okay.
60 seconds, 10 questions, okay? Are you ready?
I'm ready.
So, startup or corporate?
Startup.
Environmental or social impact?
Environmental.
Build new or modernize?
Modernize.
Rent or own a car?
Rent.
Work from home or from the office?
From the office.
Disruptive or keeping with tradition?
Disruptive.
You had to think about it.
Yeah, of course.
Urban or rural area?
Urban.
Functional or aesthetic?
Aesthetic.
High rise or low rise building?
Low rise.
Okay, and last one. The one building you personally would never demolish?
I think my grandparents' house in the south of France.
And therefore we find the most beautiful building that you know. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's 400 years old, right? So it's a good time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Okay, wow. 400 years.
It's a sign for sustainability,
Yeah, and this is actually the perfect end. Thank you so much for joining us, Thibault. It was, I have to say, again, super interesting what you shared. So looking forward, keeping in touch with you. Thank you for being our guest.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Urban Tech VC, a podcast for urban leaders shaping the cities of tomorrow. If you love our show, do drop us a review, share it with your friends, and follow 2BX on LinkedIn or Instagram. And if you are about to raise a round, drop us a note at LinkedIn or via email at idea@2bx.vc. Let's have a talk and see where we can help.